Hi, I'm Paul Bloom. I'm a professor of psychology at Yale University. And what I want to do today is talk about the field of psychology, the science of the human mind. Now, I'm admittedly biased, but I think psychology is the most interesting of all fields. It's the most interesting because it's about us. It's about the most important and intimate aspects of our lives. It's about language and perception. It's about our memory of things. It's about our dreams, love, hate. It's about morality, our sense of right and wrong. It's about when things go wrong, as in depression or anxiety. It's about happiness. It's about everything that matters to us. Psychology is a huge field, and it breaks up into different subfields. Some psychologists study the brain. They study neuroscience, the question of how this physical lump of flesh we have gives rise to our mental life. Other psychologists, like me, are developmental psychologists. We study how babies turn into children and how children turn into adults. How does a baby or child think differently from an adult? Some psychologists study social psychology, which concerns the relationship of people with other people, as with regard to questions like prejudice or persuasion. Others are cognitive psychologists. A cognitive psychologist treats the brain like a complicated computer and asks questions like, how do we solve computational problems like understanding language or recognizing faces or remembering facts? Some psychologists approach this from an evolutionary perspective, looking at the question of how the mind evolved. Many people, when they think of psychology, they think of clinical psychology. They think of Dr. Phil and Freud and people who are involved with mental illness, and a lot of psychologists do study this. I'm going to talk about 3 separate case studies. I'm going to talk about compassion, racism, and sex. The first case study is compassion. What I mean by compassion is concern for other people. This is particularly interesting to me. This is my own research program. In my own laboratory at Yale, we look at the emergence of morality in babies and young children, and we particularly focus on the emergence of compassion. At what point in development do babies care about others? At what point in development does feelings of empathy and sympathy, sometimes anger, guilt, other moral emotions, how do they arise? To what extent are they built in? To what extent do they have to be learned? As a starting point, I have here a picture of a baby, and inside the baby's head is the baby's brain. The baby's brain is an extraordinary computing machine. There are, by some estimates, 100 billion neurons in the baby's brain. Now, neurons are basic cells that process and transmit information. And by one estimate, there's about 1.8 million connections between neurons that created per second. To give you a feeling of the complexity of the baby's brain, I'll use an analogy from Jeff Hawkins. Imagine a football stadium. Fill it up with cooked spaghetti. Then shrink it to the size of a soccer ball. Then make it much, much, much denser. And then you'll have some understanding of how much is going on inside a brain, inside even a baby's brain. Now, that much we know for sure. But where the real debate goes on concerns the nature of that computational structure. There's one view that is held by many philosophers and many psychologists, which is that the brain starts off as a blank slate, what the philosopher John Locke called a tabula rasa. And what goes on in development, the point of all those connections per second, is learning, is sucking up information from the environment. The baby starts off knowing nothing and turns into an adult by virtue of absorbing information at a tremendously powerful rate. Many philosophers and many psychologists, including me and my colleagues, are more enamored of another view. We don't deny that learning takes place, but we would argue in addition to that, there is an extraordinary early understanding, early specialization. The brain could better be understood in terms of what the psychologists Lida Cosmides and John Tooby described as a Swiss Army knife. It has many different parts, and each part is specialized for a different function. So much of the action in psychology has been a running debate over which view is right. Many people would argue that In that regard, the baby starts off with nothing. The idea is children start off immoral, monsters, or if not monsters, at least they know not for good and evil. This is not the view which I think is supported by the data. I think there's now more and more data in support of a different view of compassion. We know that young babies, as they become capable of moving voluntarily, will share. They will share food, for instance, with their siblings and with kids that they're around. They will soothe. If they see somebody else in pain, even the youngest of toddlers will try to reach out and pat the person, maybe hand over a toy. There's some lovely studies finding that slightly older children are able to help others. When they see somebody who's unable to fulfill a goal, they'll seek out to come to their aid. So one elegant demonstration of this comes from a recent set of experiments where they take a toddler, put him or her in a situation where an adult is in some sort of mild distress, and see if the toddler will voluntarily help, even without any prompting. And they find that toddlers typically do. There seems to be some sort of impulse in us that's altruistic, that's kind, that's compassionate. In all of these cases, however, the kindness we see seems to apply to people who are close to us, who are either physically in our proximity, or who are our siblings, or our parents, or our friends. So the question arises, how broad does this compassion extend? Now, some people would argue that we start off with a very broad compassion. We would extend it to all individuals, to all people. But there's evidence supporting a somewhat different view, which is there's a moral instinct in us, there's a moral sense in us, but it's initially very narrow. It's only triggered by those close to us. In fact, our natural default feelings towards a stranger, far from being compassionate, is actually some sort of mixture of fear and hatred.